This is our dry farm plot. There's going to be an insectary strip that got taken over, and it was of Tulsi. All the Tulsi has, at this point, has died. But this is all our dry farm plot. We have, I believe, 16 or 17 rows of it. And when we're talking about dry farm, it's want to make the distinction between dry farm and rain-fed farming or rain-fed agriculture. Dry farm is really taking advantage of those drought months. For a little brief history of dry farm, I mean it's been happening for a very, very, very long time. But more recently, when we're talking about dry farm tomatoes, it was popularized down in Santa Cruz area, a little bit north in Pescadero, Davenport, where Ansley and I were farming prior to this. Prior to being out here, we were at Homeless Garden Project in Santa Cruz, and that's where we really started getting the craze of dry farms. And if anybody's been down in Central Coast California, it is like a craze. When dry farm tomato season is out, it's I don't know, it's something else to behold. But it got popularized by this one farm, Molino Creek, up in Davenport, and they started out in this next to Bureau of Land Management land, and it started out of a point of necessity. They had a dried out lake that would seasonally flood, or so I guess it was a seasonal pond, but didn't have any resource, didn't have any access to water, irrigation, power, anything like that, and so they started growing tomatoes, started growing winter squash. I think more specifically spaghetti squash was the one that they were really focusing on. And what they found was that what happened with the tomatoes is that because it didn't have that water to be drawing from as it was ripening or as the plant was reaching its maturation and fruiting, it ended up converting a lot more of the starch to sugar rather than filling it up with water. So it ends up with the fruits themselves will be far sweeter. If you have like an irrigated tomato, you're going to have more sugar content in the dry farm, and that's just because it doesn't have any water to be drawing from. Another thing that ends up happening, and just to be clear, like these actually, I guess this last week was the first amount of water that these have gotten in their entire year. But prior to that, I'd be walking out here and just looking at them being like really like sad and kind of stressed and get really excited, which is not like the usual thing when you're seeing stressed out plants. But it's pretty beautiful. But we do absolutely no irrigation on any of these plants. If we're talking about that from like a water conservation standpoint, evapotranspiration rate would be about an inch plus a week, average throughout the growing season. Some weeks you might have 2, some weeks you might have, if it's like, I don't even know what the evapotranspiration rate was during that heat wave. But that means that you want to be irrigating to cover for that evapotranspiration or that water loss. And so if we're talking about an inch of irrigation per acre, I'm going to be doing a super rough estimate. It's somewhere around like 27,000 gallons of water. And then you expand that on average. And so understanding that if you have a week that has a heat wave and you're having to irrigate 2-3 inches, that then becomes 45, 46 into like 75,000 gallons of water per acre. And if you extend that to say 12-week season, 10-12-week season, then you're looking at a water usage of about 330,000 gallons of water per season per acre. Again, understanding that one of our great limitations is our 5,000 gallon cistern trying to feed 5 acres of cropland. Dry farming really makes sense for one. Down in California, down in Santa Cruz where we were farming prior, the draw to dry farm wasn't the water conservation, the draw was really the flavor. The chefs would love getting the dry farms just specifically because they had that much more sweetness. Some of our friends over at Molino Creek would freeze them and then eat them throughout the year, and they were just like these like really delicious candies. Yeah.
What other crops does this work well on? Maybe tomatoes are like the best?
Just in case folks didn't hear, asking like what are some other crops that dry farming works well on. OSU has a dry farm collaborative that they do a lot of experiments with. In dry farming, the crops that they're working with that we're going to be adding to our dry farm experiments in the future are going to be corn, dry beans, melons, summer and winter squash. Actually, Two Dog Farms down in California has, because when they're doing melons, they're more specifically doing like cantaloupe, gallias, things like that. But some of our friends at Two Dog Farms down in the Pescadero region, they've tried with sugar baby watermelons to really amazing success. And grapes. There's quite a few vineyards who've been starting to adopt dry farming grapes. They more specifically go for red grapes, red varieties. I don't know enough about grape production to be able to tell you why that is.
Is it wine or table grapes?
Wine. Yeah.
What about peppers?
Peppers, I'm sure you can. It's one of those things where it's like there's ones that have been tried and true in the past, and then there's some that's like my thought is why not try it out on at least like a row or something like that. Yeah. There's 3 questions. Start with Lisa.
Do you start these in the greenhouse from seed, and then you put them in the ground when they're ready to be transplanted? Do you stop watering at that point, or do you water them a little bit just to get them going some more? So is it fruit or?
No, they get absolutely no water the second they hit the field. Which is actually kind of interesting that we've had that most recent rain, because now you can see all of that wheat seed bank is finally like it's time.
So what time of year do you get them into the ground?
Ideally, this year we got them in a little bit late. It would be about May time, the typical tomato time. The one consideration with dry farming is that, and one of the things that water really helps with is making nutrients plants available and making it more soluble in the soil and something that the plants can really take up. Which is one of the challenges with dry farming is how do you get those? How do you make sure that you have the nutrients throughout the season in a plant available form? And really, one of that works out in 2 different ways. One, before planting out, we do give it a nice little fertigation or a root soak. In our greenhouse, we have this really nice kiddie pool. Which was also wonders during a heat wave. So we will do a bottom feeding prior to plant out, and that'll give it that sort of that boost and that boost to get established. And then once they're established, because we're not putting any water on it, the roots really spread out a lot more. The root system is far more robust. There it is. Yeah, root system is far more robust and does a lot more scavenging. It does get water throughout the year as it's following that water table down, but there's a certain point where it just stops getting any water altogether. And then it'll look really sad and dry, and it's beautiful. Yeah.
You mentioned refrigeration. Have you done any dehydrating for longevity of your crops?
Not for these. I would say not yet for these.
We have had dehydrated dry farm tomatoes though, and they are literally candy. It's so good.
I feel comfortable inviting folks in to just pick one. Yeah, folks want to go into the aisles, just find a good red one, check the bottoms. Oh, another really important thing when we're talking about like the varieties that are dry farmed. Yeah. The one that's more historically done is Early Girl. What we're growing right now is New Girl, which I believe is a dehybridized. Not.
I was wondering, you mentioned like the wetlands around here. Do you think that helps with the dry farming? Because you said the roots follow the water table down. Like, would you be able to do it if you were not as in a wetland area as well?
Yes to both. Yes to both. So like because that's super important. So like where the soil that we have right here, it is actually split down the middle. Half of it is tuck muck, tequila muck, and then the other half is Indianola silty loam. And we do have wetlands throughout the farm. Actually, right behind y'all was a recent wetlands that we're going to be planting out, I guess, tomorrow. But that does mean that because we have heavier soils, more clay content, it holds on to nutrients, it holds on to water a lot longer. And so it does help along the process of ensuring that there's water through that establishment. I've also grown them in super sandy soil. And it has, the same thing happens. Like we'll still be getting that dry farm effect to it. I didn't really notice too many differences between the quality of the tomatoes or, it definitely does affect like just the amount of nutrients that you're able to hold. And when you're working with the sandy soils, we would do applications of calcium to it because the calcium would be more mobile in sandy soils and than in the clay, heavier clay content.
Why do you need calcium for tomatoes?
Structure. The structure. Otherwise, you'll get when you get that blossom end rot. That's indicative of calcium deficiency or like infrequent heavy watering, which is sort of the same thing as saying that calcium is mobile in soils. One of the things that I really rely on when planting and looking for varieties to try dry farm on is taking advantage of that hybrid vigor. Because you're creating these stressful conditions for the plants that are not conducive to growth, and so having anything that's on your side that'll produce more of that vigor. Hybridization being one of them, or dehybridization also being one of them.
I heard you say that the rain kind of initiated weeds to grow, so was it pretty weed-free and like low maintenance to dry farm compared to traditional like irrigation farming?
Yeah, we did, this is still from just one weeding. We did one weeding of this through the year. And the other, I keep wanting to call it wet farmed. The rest of our tomatoes, all the heirlooms are all, we've had 2 rounds of weeding and then, at a certain point, just let it go.
Did you grow a line of tomatoes wet farmed that are also new girls, like as a control?
No. I really kind of hate the flavor of new girls when they are irrigated. We've done that in the past, and the result has been I don't know, new girl. I mean, I personally just think like new girls are kind of like a relatively flavorless.
How do you guys deal with pests?
We haven't had too many pest problems. We did have one really blighty tomato over here that Ansley pulled out. It was right here. We will have specific like thresholds. Once it'll reach an economic threshold, we'll potentially be able to go and fix for it. Unfortunately, the pests that have really hit that point are wireworms. And we're continuing to figure out ways to be managing them on the scale that we are. If we see like a pretty heavy blight, we'll pull that and remove it out of the fields. For the most part, I mean, if we see blight now, it's like, well, it's about time. Invertebrate pests, we really haven't had any. Vertebrate pests, we have a thriving eastern cottontail population here.
Given you got about a week to work with in this particular crop here, there's still a lot of green tomatoes. Will you still collect them together with healthy ripe ones, and hopefully they'll ripen?
We will still harvest them. We'll keep them separate from the ripe ones. That's another really good point about these is that because new girls, early girls, they have a longer shelf life than a lot of the heirlooms. But one of the things that dry farm does is that if you were biting into the tomato, the skin would be quite a bit thicker. So one of the reasons we don't, there's a few reasons we don't mulch. One is just sheer labor, since it's just the two of us. Trying to, and I actually remember, like, when we finished this whole row, I looked at Ansley and told her, like, what have I done?
I still think that frequently.
Another reason is with if we were to lay down a lot of mulch, one of the big things that we try to do is have as robust of a cover cropping system as possible. And the more mulch that we're incorporating in the system, the more nitrogen it's locking up, and the more time it'll take for that mulch to ultimately break down. Eventually, the overall goal and plan for the property and the site would be to be incorporating rotational cultivation or rotational tillage, and that would really be around. More specifically, that would be in our brassicas, our more direct seeded crops, the heavy rotation crops, and then the tomatoes and peppers. Not to say we won't be trying with some no-till and some of the tomatoes.
Well, since you weren't watering, you didn't have a lot of green leafage growing then, and so you didn't have to trim back shoots, or did you have to still do that?
We did. We were pretty intensive on pruning to 2 liters. We'll usually space out 18 inches on center with 2 liters, leaving 9 inches about per liter. I think some of these we actually did 18 and 24 inches to see the difference between them.
Yeah, and you can actually see some of these base shoots on this plant right here,
Okay, yeah.
since we're not here on a weekly basis.
How deep did you plant them, and how big were the plants when you planted them? Like what size pot were they in a container?
Honestly, these, because we got hit by our greenhouse. One of the reasons why it's the shape it is now, it got taken out by that winter storm, and so we lost a lot of stuff at that point, and then lost some more things to disease. So we were planting right out of a 72 cell tray, 72 and 50 cell tray into it, and trying to dig them as deep as possible. So the plants really weren't that big.
You did all right though.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So far out of just this patch, we've gotten. We have well over 150 pounds left on the plants, and we've already gotten 233 as of tomorrow. Not counting the ones that we just take for ourselves. And then I'm actually kind of interested to see, because there's really not that much disease, how they're going to hold up against this rain.
Follow up to
Yeah.
that yield. In this area, since it's dry farmed, are you yielding less than what an irrigated patch of this size would do?
Yeah.
Okay.
We are, yeah. Because the fruits aren't able to get as large. Actually, at our last farm in Santa Cruz, we had one row of irrigated early girls, and some of those would be like a weird beefsteak size early girl, but be pretty flavorless. But yeah, you would expect a smaller yield, but it's also I don't know, at a certain point, quality over quantity, and it's just trying to work that point where that quality is valued, and trying to figure out how to increase some of those markets for a dry farm crop. Yeah.
So you mentioned yield. Is the distribution solely out of 21 acres, or is it somewhere else too?
Yes. It's out of 21 acres. A lot of the crops will go to Brook here in the farm market, and then we worked with partnerships over different contracts through Fair Start and with Boys and Girls Club King County, and we also partner with a whole bunch of mutual aid organizations, and partner with Farm Stand Local Foods food access arm of their organization. So it'll, because one of our large philosophies is that we don't want to be we want to try to limit the amount that we're going to be competing with other farmers, and especially since the second COVID hit is actually one of the reasons why we expanded as much as we did. We're sort of foreseeing a lot of the supply chain. You know, what we saw with the supply chain, we were expecting that to happen, and so tried developing those partnerships with organizations that were working in either mutual aid or in or with like meal service programs or yeah, and then out of that we ended up getting more contracts to be growing for them, and yeah.
So you're not necessarily in competition with the existing CSAs then?
Mm-mm. No, we actually specifically will likely never do a CSA for that reason. Which makes it really fun to try to sell produce when you have like mostly a lot of it's like self-imposed as well. Like we definitely don't want to be because we're a nonprofit. We have other sources of funding. And so if we can be doing experiments out here that can make take some of those failures away from other farmers, that's awesome. That's wonderful. Anyone want to see some pigs, some cover crop? All right. Also, if anybody has questions, feel free.